So I'd like to talk about some of the evolutionary mechanisms that explain family dynamics. And then I'll talk about some of the parasitic ideas that attack the family unit. Why, at least in academia, why is there such hostility toward the family? So those are the two key themes that I'll be covering. So how did I first become interested in evolutionary psychology? I read the following book, Homicide, which I highly recommend for everybody in the audience. It's a book that looks at patterns of criminality from an evolutionary lens. And there are two phenomena that are very relevant to the family. These are ugly phenomena, bad things that happen in families. Number one, the Cinderella effect. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. You've all heard of Cinderella. She's the evil stepmother. Well, it turns out that the number one predictor of there being child abuse in a home, by a factor of 100-fold greater than the second variable, is if there is a step-parent in the home. So simply having biologically intact families serves as a great protection against child abuse. Now, that doesn't mean that most step-parents are evil, but to the extent that we want to try to mitigate child abuse, having biologically intact families helps. The second phenomenon that I learned in this book many years ago is who's the number one most dangerous person in a woman's life around the world throughout all of time period. It's not the guy hiding in the tree trying to attack you. It's usually the husband. And what is the number one reason that husbands go into homicidal rages, which again is perfectly explained from an evolutionary perspective? It's because of suspected or realized infidelity. Why are men so non-receptive to the idea of sexual infidelity? Because there is such a thing as paternity uncertainty. The idea is that there is no maternity uncertainty, but there is paternity uncertainty. We are a biparental species. Human dads invest a lot in their children, and therefore all of us in this room come from ancestors that cared that their women didn't go around with every second guy, because then I'd be spending 18 years raising the child of the sexy gardener rather than my own child. Continuing with paternity uncertainty, when a child is born across cultures, we have here I think something like 60 countries represented, across all cultures, when a child is born, what the people around the family say is that the child looks exactly like the father, even though objectively speaking, that is simply not true. And the mother's side of the family are the ones who are likely to insist that the baby looks exactly like the father. So we didn't grow up with DNA paternity tests, but we've evolved cultural norms that try to convince us, don't worry, this is your child, invest in that child. So for example, if you look at those two gorgeous children, please tell me that they look like me. Otherwise, my wife has a lot of explaining to do. She's sitting right here. So anyway, so there are many of these phenomena that very much are in the family context that demonstrate how our minds, the architecture of our mind has evolved precisely in the context of family dynamics. So to have parasitic ideas that try to dissuade us from having families is literally anti-human nature. Now this, I love to tell this story because it, well, you'll see in a second why. So as I told you a minute ago, when a child is born, people say he looks exactly like the father. But this is the first example ever where that phenomenon happened in utero. Let me explain. So my wife and I have 2 children together. Yes, we are below the 2.1 replacement rate, and I apologize for that. But this is the photo of any of you who've had children, the first ultrasound. You put it up on the fridge, you're very proud to be new parents. And so this is the exact image that we had on our fridge when my mother-in-law came over. Now this image, you can't tell if it's a dinosaur, you can't tell if it's a COVID virus, but apparently my mother-in-law looked at it and said, "Oh my God, Dad, the baby looks exactly like you." So maybe I should be worried about my wife, because apparently my mother-in-law was trying to convince me that it is my child, even when the child was inside my wife's stomach. So there are four key Darwinian mechanisms that drive much of our behavior. There's the survival mechanism, things that are related to survival. There's reproduction mechanism, things related to sexual selection. Of relevance to this conference is the third one, kin selection. Kin selection refers to why it is that we would have evolved altruistic behavior towards our kin. Well, if you understand that evolution operates at the gene level, then it makes perfect evolutionary sense for me to jump into the river to save 3 of my children. Even though I may perish, even though I may die, from an evolutionary calculus perspective, it makes perfect sense for this type of altruism to have evolved. And so kin selection, again, of relevance to this conference, family dynamics, is embedded within the architecture of the human mind. So nothing could be more natural than to promote family life. So what are some family dynamics that are very much related to evolution? I'll talk maybe about the first couple. So as I said, we are a biparental species. Human dads are truly super dads. We may not invest as much as mothers do, but compared to other animals, we truly are super dads. And our children have a very long period of juvenility, meaning that it takes a very long time of investing in them before they enter the sexual maturity. And so it makes perfect evolutionary sense for us to have evolved the desire for monogamous long-term coupling. So romantic love is an emotional system that evolved precisely because we are a biparental species. The second phenomenon that I'll quickly talk about is parental investment theory. Parental investment theory explains patterns of sex differences across every sexually reproducing species, including humans. And it basically says the following. You look within a species at the two sexes. Whichever sex provides the greater minimal obligatory parental investment is the sex that's going to be smaller. It's the sex that's going to be more sexually choosy, that's going to be less risk-taking. Why? Because if for women's case they make a wrong mate choice, the costs loom much larger than it does for men, for obvious reasons. And so patterns of sex differences exist not because of random socialization, not because of the patriarchy, not because of cultural learning. They are embedded within the most fundamental features of our biology. One more point, I won't talk all of this third one, since we're talking about fathers. It turns out that whether a father is present in the home or not present in the home, it affects something as physiologically intimate as when a young girl first has her menstrual cycle. So imagine here the interaction between an environmental variable, presence or absence of a father, and something as fundamental as when you first have your menstrual cycle. When a father is absent from the home, young girls enter menarche, which is the first menstrual cycle, earlier. In other words, they enter the reproductive window earlier if her father is not absent. So again, there are very profound psychological, emotional, and physiological reasons why it makes sense for young children to grow up in biologically intact families. Speaking of this idea of kin is the fancy term for families, bloodlines. I just want to mention a few studies that have been done. Some of them have been done by myself and some of my teammates, some of my co-authors, looking at, for example, gift giving. How much we spend on gifts is perfectly correlated to the genetic relatedness between the giver and the recipient. Now, many people don't know this on a conscious level, but we've evolved the mental calculus to exactly strategically allocate our investments based on genetic relatedness. How much money I give to various family members if I win the lottery follows that. Wills, when you pass away, what you bequeath follows that. How much pain you're willing to incur physically to help a family member follows that. So again, this calculus is embedded within the architecture of the human mind. Families are a fundamental feature of being human. From a cultural perspective, many of the biblical stories, the Greek tragedies, the Shakespearean plays, the top television shows and movies, all happen in family contexts. And that's not by accident, it's precisely because both some of the most beautiful things and some of the most dramatic things happen within family dynamics. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to if we have evolved to build families, to reproduce, to invest in children, why are there such movements that are attacking families? And so before I do that, let me just mention with this one slide, government policies, products, commercial products, political systems that do not recognize our innate human nature, they always fail. You can't create policies, products, and political systems that are antithetical to human nature. Let me mention 3 cases. So in the US right now, many of you know, a lot of progressive district attorneys and progressive judges are trying to do away with, a punishing penal system. The idea is that a criminal has already been victimized by society, so it would be wrong of you to double victimize them by punishing them. But of course that violates a fundamental feature of, the consequences of your action, right? So for example, in San Francisco now, if you steal less than $950, well then that's okay. It's only when you get to 951 that maybe we'll pay attention to you. It doesn't take a fancy evolutionary psychologist to recognize that that's going to result in negative consequences on society. Consequences matter. You should be held accountable for your actions. The second example is one that I often discuss when I teach consumer psychology. So if you want to understand the psychology of women, study romance novels. Why? Because romance novels are almost exclusively read by women around the world. And the male archetype in the romance novel is the exact same male archetype in every single romance novel that's ever been written. He's tall, he's a prince, he's also a neurosurgeon, he wrestles alligators on his six-pack and he wins, and he's reckless and a risk-taker, and he can only be tamed by the love of this one woman. I just described every romance novel ever written. Now there is a company that was progressive that wanted to get rid of this view of toxic masculinity. And so they created a romance novel line where the male archetype was super sensitive, where he cried a lot, where he sucked his thumb, where he went into a fetal position. Guess what the women in Bolivia and Nigeria and Japan said? No, I'm not interested in your progressive new definition of male. I'm very good with my own sexual fantasies, thank you. So again, if you create products that are contrary to human nature, the market will correct you. Okay? And the third example, which speaks to political systems that are antithetical to human nature, E.O. Wilson, some of you may know him, he recently passed away, and one of my great regrets is I never got to know him, even though we have a lot of scientific topics in common. He was a Harvard biologist who studied social ants. Now, social ants have a very unique social structure. There is a reproductive queen, and everybody else is equal. They're all worker ants and soldier ants. And so when he was asked, Professor Wilson, what do you think of Marxism/communism? He said, great idea, wrong species. Meaning that if you try to impose communism, where we're all supposed to be equal outcomes, to humans, where we're not equal. We're equal under the law, but we're not equal. Some of us work harder, some of us are more talented, less talented, taller, shorter, funnier, more charisma, less charisma. And so to try to impose a political system that is contrary to human nature, it will fail, as it has failed in every society that's ever been tried. So it's important to understand evolutionary theory because it can help us design better policies, better products, better political systems, and so on. So what are some parasitic ideas? So this comes from my 2 books ago. My last book, I think I heard them mention it in Hungarian The book is called The Parasitic Mind, where I talk about how these parasitic ideas were first spawned on university campuses, how they proliferated outside the university, how they become the Prime Minister of Canada, where I come from, regrettably, and then what could be some mind vaccines that we could use to try to inoculate us against some of these parasitic ideas. Well, these parasitic ideas are actually at the root of many of the attacks on the family. So postmodernism is probably the granddaddy of all idea pathogens, because it basically purports that there are no universals other than the one universal, that there are no universals. And so what is mother? What is father? What do you mean male? What do you mean female? That's all up for debate. There are no universals that we could agree on. So it offers you the philosophical framework to then have some of the insanity that we see today. It's postmodernism that allowed us to then have debates as to whether men can menstruate or not. Radical feminism is another one. So here are two quotes that perfectly capture some of the animus that radical feminists hold towards the family. So let me read both of them. We can't destroy the inequities between men and women until we destroy marriage. That seems very nice. And then the next one, the nuclear family must be destroyed. Whatever its ultimate meaning, the breakup of families is an objectively revolutionary process. And we also have heard, marriage is a patriarchal tool. We've heard that heterosexual mating is inherently a form of rape because it is penetrative. This is not me engaging in satire. This is really what is taught in women's studies courses. Well, it doesn't, again, take a fancy evolutionary psychologist to realize that for a sexually reproducing species, maybe having penetrative sex is something that we need to do. Social constructivism is another idea pathogen that is problematic in all sorts of ways because it purports that there are no biological blueprints. We are all born tabula rasa, empty minds, and it's only the vagaries of socialization that teach us what to be. So there is no such thing as a innate role of fatherhood, innate role of motherhood. Anything goes, it's just whatever society teaches you. Biophobia is something that I experienced throughout my career. I try to Darwinize the behavioral sciences, applying biology to understand human behavior, while most social scientists detest biology. Because most social scientists argue that what makes us human is that we transcend our biology. Yes, biology matters for the mosquito, for the zebra, for the dog, but come on, professor, it doesn't apply for humans. It doesn't apply to consumers. Well, of course it applies to consumers. We don't exist outside of our biology. Other parasitic ideas that attack the family, many collectivist ideologies. Marxism, socialism, communism, Black Lives Matter, even communal farming in the Israeli context, in kibbutzim, had some animus to the family because they believe that you should rear children in communal environments, not within family units. So whenever you have a collectivist ideology, you often have an attack on family structure. And then of course, the most recent idea pathogen, please don't have children if you love Mother Earth. And this is what climate change extremism is all about. So there you have it. Oh. Now this next slide, I have it up because my most recent book, which just came out last week, is on happiness. It's actually titled The Saad Truth About Happiness, Saad being my last name, S-A-A-D. And so in the book, I look at many predictors of happiness. Well, there's a very clear